Hi everybody, welcome to week 11. Last week in week 10, we covered the final trade model, intra-industry trade. This week, we will be moving to strategic trade policy, which is chapter 11 of the textbook. This builds on from trade policy, which was covered in week 8 and week 9 of the course. The main idea for this week's course is to look at trade policy but under imperfect competition. So we're going to move away from perfect competition when we apply or investigate tariffs and quotas. And we're going to see, okay, if we apply certain policies, how would they then be beneficial for everyone involved? So when government intervenes, we're going to say, okay, this happens for consumers, this happens for producers, and this happens for government. And then we're also going to look at a bit of different perspectives. We're going to look at the Brander perspective, we're going to look at the Spencer and Eaton perspective, and we're going to look at the Grossman perspective when analyzing strategic trade policy. So those are the three main perspectives that we're going to be looking at. But we're going to find out that even in general, when we have imperfect competition and when we have beneficial policy, that this policy that may exist is maybe very limited. There are only so much options we can take. And we can find that when even if government interacts and they think they're doing something good, that at the end of it, they might end up doing real harm to the economy. So these are the type of things we're going to look at. And for now, what you need to take from this is we're looking at everything in terms of imperfect competition. So we have some market power, maybe it's a monopoly, maybe it's monopsony, maybe it's an oligopoly or something like that. We're only limiting it to what the textbook is saying. What we're going to build on here is the idea of where is equilibrium happening for autarky. When we're dealing with perfect competition, then equilibrium occurs where the demand curve equals to the marginal cost curve, or with prices equal to your marginal cost curve. That is P equals to MC. That is a condition you should have learned from second year and third year microeconomics. And at that point, that would mean that QPC is what is being supplied in the market and PPC is what the price is in the market. But we are dealing with a monopoly. So when we're dealing with a monopoly, the equilibrium condition is when marginal revenue equals to marginal cost. That is where the red dotted line intersects with the solid blue line. At that point, when it intersects, we need to find what the price is of a monopoly. And that you have to price off the demand curve. Right, so you trace the point of intersection of your blue line and your red dotted line, you trace it vertically upwards onto the demand curve at the dot called MON, monopoly. And that is where you can now determine what your prices are that a monopoly is going to charge under equilibrium, under autarky. So that is PMON, the prices of monopoly. At the same time, we know what the quantity is being supplied in this equilibrium condition for monopoly, that is QMON. So those are the most important things you need to pick up. But what you should also realize, unlike when we were dealing with perfect competition where there is no markup, where there is no difference between your prices that is charged in the market and your marginal costs, when we deal with a monopoly, there is a difference. The cost that is being charged in equilibrium and autarky when you're dealing with a monopoly, or the cost that is incurred by the monopoly firm, is CMON. Right? That is the cost you incur. And the prices that the monopoly is charging is PMON. So there is a clear difference between the prices of the monopoly and the cost of the monopoly, and that is called your markup. Right? Whenever you ask what is markup, markup is the difference between the price in the market and the marginal cost in the market for whatever competitive structure we're dealing with. That's important to know. Now, unfortunately, we're going to have some trade, and there's going to be some form of trade restrictions that we're going to put in place. So when we're dealing with free trade and we're looking at the idea of trade restrictions, the type of trade restrictions that we're going to implement is going to differ when we're looking at the competitive structure. Competitive structure means here, when we're looking at monopoly, this is best to follow. When we're dealing with perfect competition, this is the best type of trade policy that we need to follow. So the first part of our analysis of a trade restriction is a repetition of what we did in week 8 when we looked at trade policy and the implementation of a tariff. Nothing new here. So normally speaking, under autarky, when we find equilibrium on what the prices are in the market, that is where the demand curve intersects with the marginal cost curve. So that is where QPC is being supplied in the market, and PPC is what the price is in the market for a closed economy. Unfortunately speaking, or fortunately speaking, we open up for free trade. The prices have to be P world, or it's given as P world in our case. We're assuming the prices are cheaper overseas or in general in the world than what it is locally here for our own country. What that causes with the lower prices is only QS being supplied in the market, but now at the lower price we have QD being demanded. So there's now excess demand, and that excess demand is met through the imports that we as a country will purchase from overseas. In the end, what that means is we have an increase in consumer surplus and a decrease in producer surplus when we are moving from autarky to free trade. Unfortunately speaking, maybe there's some lobbying from producers or government wants some revenue. What they now do is now implement the tariff, which is the dotted brown line. And what that causes is consumer loss, a producer gain, and government revenue. What is the consumer loss? The consumer loss are all the colored shapes. So that is the light blue shape, the checkered brown and white areas or triangles, and the green rectangle. Those are what is lost for consumers. Producers gain what? They gain the light blue area. Government gains the green striped area. And then the brown and white checkered areas is what is lost to society. Consumers lost it. Unfortunately, producers didn't gain it, and nor did revenue from government gain those areas. So those is lost completely. We're obviously assuming here, and then we're dealing with a small country. This is nothing new from the previous work. Right, so we don't need to analyze any more welfare effects from that. And you need to be very aware of these type of graphs, because these can be asked in your exams at some point. What happens now if we introduce free trade? If we have a world price? Now, the one thing you need to understand, when there's a world price in place, every firm needs to price at that world price. If they set their price higher, what happens? People will just buy from other firms or from other countries who sell at the world price. So the world price forces, whether you have a monopoly in your country or if you have perfect competition, it forces you to price at the world price. But there's conditions to this, right? So where does this condition exist? So the first thing you need to consider is, what is the tariff that we're going to put in place? When there's no tariff in place, we price at the world price. There's a demand of QS and there's a demand of QD at that world price, and there's an excess demand that causes the country to import, right? Regardless of what market structure there is. But when you introduce tariffs, it changes everything. As long as that tariff you add does not increase the world price more than the perfect competition price, then market structure would not matter. Let me say that again. When you take your world price and you add your tariff, and both of those added together is not more than what the perfect competition price is, then it does not matter whether you're dealing with perfect competition or whether you're dealing with monopoly, because that price being less than what perfect competition still forces every type of company and country to price it that, because you still have the option of buying this product cheaper overseas. So the analysis when the tariff added to the world price being less than perfect competition, the analysis stays the same as before when you introduce a tariff. The same as before, the same as in chapter 8, the same that exists for perfect competition. Right, that's the most important thing you need to take home. Now, what changes? When does the scenario change? The scenario changes when the tariff added to the world price is exactly equal to the perfect competition price. When that occurs, then we have exactly perfect competition. You can't charge any more, you can't charge any less than with that tariff exactly in place. So the analysis when you're dealing with a world price and a tariff equal to the perfect competition is exactly discussing the idea that of perfect competition, even if there was a monopoly in place. What happens now if you consider the idea that when you add the tariff to the world price, that it's more than the perfect competition's price? When that occurs, that is called a prohibitive tariff, because what you're putting in place is a tariff so high that with the world price, it's preventing any imports from coming in place. Because what will you do then? You will just buy locally, right? If you're forcing the price from overseas guys to be more than what can be the local price under perfect competition, then what happens for consumers is that they then just buy locally. Who's going to pay a higher price when you can buy it locally? This is under the scenario of perfect competition. Right? We assume there's a lot of firms. So you can never have a tariff being so much more that it pushes the world price more than what the perfect competition price is. This is under perfect competition. Unfortunately, the scenario differs. If there's a monopoly, meaning there's one firm in your country, when you put in place any tariff that when added to the world price exceeds the perfect competition, then you give all the power back to this monopoly. They can now charge that higher price. But what is the highest price that they can charge? The highest price that they can charge, being a monopoly where you have a tariff that when added to the world price exceeds the perfect competition, is a tariff that is equal to the difference between the monopoly price under autarky and less the price of the world. We say that again. The maximum price or the maximum tariff that can be put in place where a monopoly still has power, where it still has incentive to make profit, is when the price of the monopoly, or where the tariff is equal to the difference between the price of the monopoly and the price of the world. That's the maximum tariff you can put in place. If the tariff exceeds that difference, then the company is going to make less and less profits. So the incentive for the company or for this one monopoly stays in place as long as the tariff difference is not more than the difference between the monopoly price and the world price. That is an important thing that you need to understand, because if that difference exceeds that difference between monopoly and the world price. If the tariff exceeds that difference, then we find that the monopoly is making or is losing its profitability. So that's the things you need to consider. You need to consider 3 scenarios. The scenario where the tariff added to the world price is less than perfect competition. In that case, we're dealing with where the market structure doesn't matter. The analysis is normal as per chapter 8. Then you deal with the second scenario where the tariff and the world price, when they add them together exactly the same as perfect competition, then we're dealing with a scenario where we are actually dealing with a normal perfect competition under autarky. Right? And then we deal with the third analysis where the world price plus the tariff exceeds the perfect competition price. And that only matters when we're dealing with what? When we're dealing monopoly. Because under that scenario, as that tariff increases and when added to the world price, becomes closer and closer and closer towards the monopoly price, more and more profits are being made by the monopoly. But as soon as it exceeds the difference between, what I mean by exceed here, as soon as the tariff exceeds the difference between the monopoly price and the world price, then unfortunately this monopoly company is now losing its profitability. And you need to be able to understand those 3 scenarios when you do a discussion about market power and tariffs. So we can summarize everything. If you look at the brown arrows, all right, that's on the right, we can discuss them in terms of smallest to biggest arrows. So there are 3 small arrows, 3 small brown arrows. The 3 small brown arrows represent a scenario where market structure doesn't matter. If the tariffs are that large as that tariffs are, market structure doesn't matter. We have the same analysis of looking at what is supplied in this local market versus what is demanded in this local market, which is depicted by the purple arrows. Right? This is your imports that exist when tariffs are of those 3 smallest arrows. But when we deal with the 4th smallest arrow or the 3rd largest brown arrow or tariff being in place, then we're dealing with a scenario that we are under perfect competition. Right? A tariff of that size forces us to be under perfect competition, and we're basically working like we were under autarky with a perfect competition structure. But if we're dealing with the 5th and 6th, or we're dealing with the 2 largest tariffs put in place, the 2 largest tariffs that we see here in terms of the brown, then we're dealing with the idea that if it was a perfect competition structure, it wouldn't matter, right? Because nobody will buy overseas. Those tariffs are so high, it forces you to buy from the local market, which is where the normal demand equals supply. But those 2 largest tariffs matters when we're dealing with monopoly. When we have a monopoly, they're going to price at whatever those tariffs lead to. So they're going to price at that 2 higher red circles or the 2 higher gold circles on the red line. Those are where the monopoly is going to price. That is where it's going to make profits. It's not going to price at any other place. The arrows or the tariffs is forcing it to price at a higher position because it's the only firm in the place and it's the place where it's going to make the most profit. It's not going to be stupid enough to price lower than what that tariff is allowing it to price at. Okay. But remember that the largest arrow here, the largest brown arrow or tariff, is the most the tariff can put in place. Anything larger than that is going to lead to a loss of profitability. So in a sense, what the arrows is showing and the tariffs being increasing is showing that gradually raising a tariff allows a domestic monopoly to follow its normal pricing regime. But that is only effective once we have a tariff that basically pushes the total price, which is the world price and the tariff, above that of perfect competition. And you need to be able to understand the scenarios as I've said on the previous slide. Market structure plays a big role on whether it makes it easy to convert a quota to a tariff. If we're dealing with perfect competition, then the conversion of a quota to a tariff is a one-to-one relationship. What do I mean by this? It's very easy to associate a quota with a specific tariff, and the analysis is then quite the same. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with a monopoly, then it's not actually so straightforward. The quota has a two-part effect. It affects imports and it impacts on your local demand. So when you actually convert your quota, you first have to say, okay, under monopoly, under the scenario of this country, when I have a quota, it means only so much imports are being imported, or so much imports are being consumed by our country. So that is represented by the two bronzish gold circles, and it's highlighted there on your graph. It says imports. Right. That imports that you now bring into the market based on the quota can be directly linked to a value of your tariff. So you can associate the imports directly to a tariff. But you now need to understand, okay, I have my imports, I link it to a tariff. What has happened in terms of our local demand? Part of the local demand was met through what? Through the imports, through a foreign firm. So there is a leftover demand. That leftover demand, called a residual demand, is now associated with a decrease in your normal demand curve that you would have had for your country. So you see a leftward shift from your demand to a residual demand curve. That change, as we have explained, is directly caused by the quota, which says, okay, we are now forcing only a certain portion of your consumption to be held by a, or to come through a foreign firm. And if you know if your residual demand is changing, what is changing ultimately? Consumer surplus. So that is something you need to understand, that the analysis then changes under a quota. You can't take a like-for-like relationship that you would have found under perfect competition. When you're dealing now with market power and a quota, the analysis is a bit different. It's not like we can say, okay, we can directly say, okay, this quota is exactly such and such and such a tariff, and because I can liken it to each other, I can make it look similar to each other, the discussion can be similar to each other. No. The quota, as we have established, sets the amount of imports. And once you set that amount of imports, we can then liken it to a set price for tariff. But at the same time, once you've done that, it causes a residual demand. It's a leftover demand once we consider how many imports have been consumed. But in your analysis, when you're trying to profit maximize or find the equilibrium condition for a monopoly under a quota, it is still the same. It's still when marginal revenue equals to marginal cost, except that the marginal revenue that you are considering is linked to your residual demand. So you take your residual demand, you find your marginal revenue curve which is marginal revenue prime here, you find the point where it crosses the marginal cost curve. So that is the specific dot there, and you can see that is the dot that is on the dotted red line and the blue line. That then will directly help you to find what the price a monopolist would charge. The price that the monopolist would charge comes off the residual demand curve, which is P quotum. That P quotum is more than the price that is linked to a tariff. How is that so? How can you charge a price is higher than the tariff? Because you're monopoly. The only that demand that is left and the only place that consumers can buy from is locally. You can't go overseas anymore. The imports has already been limited. Right? The quota has ensured that. So what we find now that a monopoly can actually gain more when a quota is used instead of a tariff. Remember earlier when we showed the analysis of a tariff, it depended how large the tariff is. For most of the time, if the tariff wasn't large enough, what would occur is that the monopoly would not gain. A tariff needed to exceed what? The tariff price, or the final tariff price when you should have exceeded the perfect competition price for the monopoly firm to gain some form of profit. But in a quota, that doesn't need to be considered. The quota takes care of the imports. That is all sold at what price? Right? That imports, the price that is sold is that P tariff price in essence. But then for the rest of the consumption, which is less the imports in a sense, that is now linked to your residual demand. And since unfortunately that firm is the only firm, what does that mean? That means they can charge you at monopoly prices, which is the peak quotum. So if you look at it in the end, the quotas are more restrictive and they eliminate the threat of competition. What do we mean by competition? Overseas firms from participating and impacting on how a monopoly could price. So that is important to consider. And it's something that government will consider if they're looking at the market structure and trying to say, should I apply tariff? Should I apply a quota? We've shown that the trade restriction would depend on the type of competition that is in place in a domestic market. Applying a tariff or a quota is dependent on a monopoly or on perfect competition existing in the domestic market. The impacts will be different. We've also shown that quotas are more restrictive than tariffs. And usually when you deal with tariffs, you find that there's still foreign competition that exists. But with a quota, once the imports are met, there is no worries about foreign competition. It's also shown that imperfect competition generally leads to suboptimal outcomes and in principle a leeway for government intervention. So governments have the ability to influence competition positions of domestic policy through trade policy. Now, this is what we call strategic trade policy, where they implement an import quota or they implement a tariff. That is the forms of the strategic trade policy that they can put in place depending on how many competition they actually want to allow in the local markets. We're going to tackle the brand and Spencer model now. We're going to assume there's two countries, America and Britain. America is country A, Britain is country B. We're going to assume there's a third country, which is China, and we're going to call that country C. But America and Britain is the only two countries that is producing and exporting a good, and they're exporting that to China, and China is the only one that consumes this good. America does not assume this good and Britain does not consume this good. We assume there's firm A, which is the only producer in America, and basically whatever happens in terms of firms A's profits and decisions is a perfect reflection on the welfare measure for America. All right, fully, you can say firm A is basically America. We can assume the same thing for firm B. Firm B is also going to be a perfect welfare measure for Britain. And ultimately, when they're interacting in China, they're going to form or they're going to follow a Quota duopoly. What is a Quota duopoly? That is the idea that both firm and firm B will simultaneously profit maximize. When they make the profit maximization decision, they're going to do that at the same time. Now we can ask the question, what should the American government do? So the graph for Brandon Spencer does come from your textbook. You can see it in chapter 9. When we're dealing with the Quota duopoly, this is better, probably more detail when you do microeconomics in third year, when you deal with your action curves and you deal with isoprofit curves. So you just need to understand what the graphs say basically. So we have isoprofit lines, so those are your equal profit lines for firm A and firm B. The stroke or the dashed blue line is representing firm A and the dotted red line is representing firm B, right? Those are the isoprofit curves. And we have firm A's reaction curve and firm B reaction curve. Those are the solid lines, right? Red for firm B and blue for firm A. What you need to understand about the reaction curve is also known as the best response curve. So given the output of firm B, it is telling us basically what firm A would actually have in terms of output in response to the output of firm B. That is what you need to understand. That output that firm A is reacting to firm B is basically ensuring that it has or is gaining its best or most profit it can possibly get. So you look at firm A's reaction curve, the maximum profit that it can get basically is when firm B is not producing at all. So that is a Q mon stroke or Q mon comma A. That is node output for firm B and all the output for firm A, and that is where it's going to profit maximize. And then ultimately, when you're looking at the Quota model, the point of equilibrium would be with the two reaction curves, that of firm A and that of firm B, actually intersect, and that is at point C. And that point C will go through both isoprofit curves of firm A and firm B. That is your equilibrium condition. Now, when you're trying to maximize or get more welfare or for the market to gain in terms of America, what the government can do is actually apply a subsidy or allow firm A to have a subsidy. What a subsidy does is it actually pushes the reaction curve of firm A towards the right. And when that actually shifts out towards the right, it causes a new point of intersection on the red line at point PS. So that's your new equilibrium condition that would occur. And that will occur on a profit line or isoprofit curve that is actually lower than the original iso curve that pointed past through point C, but because it's closer towards the output from A's x-axis in a sense, or the output from A's blue line there at the bottom, is actually increasing in terms of profit. So what you need to take away from this analysis is in the Quota model or the Quota model, the point of equilibrium is where the two reaction curves intersect. And any subsidy will cause the reaction curve to shift outwards towards the right in terms of firm A, and that would relate to more profit, or the firm having a or the ISO profit curve of a higher value. In essence, the Brand Spencer model, which looks at the quantity that you need to put out in order to maximize profit, its optimal policy is related to subsidies, that by actually using subsidies, you can cause the reaction curves to shift and actually lead to increased welfare through increased profits. But you do know that if you're able to use subsidies, a foreign firm can also use subsidies, and that could be detrimental in the new equilibrium position that could occur based on the new reaction curves that exist for both countries. If both of them had a subsidy put in place. Note for the Brand Spencer framework, it's very restrictive. We're only looking in terms of the Quota quantity. Right, we are only considering 2 firms that are operating in a third market. We're not even taking consideration what is happening in a local market of those 2 firms. There's nothing discussed in terms of consumption in the producing countries. We're just talking about production, and we're not looking at informational requirements. Or we're considering informational requirements, but that basically means government must know everything that is happening at the same time. You must know what demand looks like, you must know what supply looks like, you must look at what the cost structure is, you must look at what competition is, and this ultimately will help with him setting the optimal policy. And if any mistakes is done, that could lead to a suboptimal outcome. The Eaton-Grossman model is not too much different from the BC model that we've done before. Still having America and Britain, is still having firm A and firm B, is still having China as country C, who is the only consumer of the one good that both America and Britain is exporting. Except now we're not dealing with the Quota duopoly, we're dealing with Vietnam price, so we're finding some optimal price, and that leads to some form of profitability. We also know now that if country B's price were to raise, that would automatically mean that the profits of firm A would be increasing. Right? If your price of your product is becoming more expensive, people are just going to switch to the product that is cheaper, which is from the other company. Again, now we are saying, okay, what should America do in a situation when we are actually trying to choose the best price for the highest profitability? The Eaton-Grossman model also has ISO profit lines, and it also has the reaction curves. The reaction curves are positive sloping because of the impact of prices. And in the case of the Vietnam model, we are looking at reaction curves that relates what is the best price that firm A should charge based on the price of firm B. That is different from the Quota model, which looked at the same analysis in terms of output. The equilibrium position would occur where the 2 reaction curves intersect. That is the green dot, the Vietnam label dot, and that would then be associated with a certain amount of profit for both firm A and firm B as they intersect at that point B, at that point of Vietnam. Unfortunately, government wants to interact. They want to say, okay, for America, how do we increase our welfare? How do we land up on a higher ISO profit line? What we could do then is to implement a suitable export tax. The export tax will cause the reaction curve of firm A to shift rightwards, and we'll have the new point of intersection at brown dot EG. Right, and this is a higher point of welfare, which and on a higher ISO profit line. It's an important thing to consider, right? So what we've seen from the Eaton-Grossman model, that the export tax is the optimal policy prescription, and it leaves a very visible, credible threat to competitors as it allows the reaction curve to shift and also ultimately leading to increased welfare. This is a bit different from the brand expenses subsidy thing. The idea here is that for the Brandon Spencer subsidy thing is that you, in a sense, with the subsidy, giving money to a firm, and that is allowing for that firm to become more profitable. Unfortunately, now when you're using a tax, this is not actually affecting your competitor directly, which firms don't like because now they can visibly see how the tax policy is actually affecting them. Unlike with a subsidy, which is a bit more subtle and more hidden, as only the firm that's getting the subsidy is actually seeing the positive impact in terms of welfare that it would have for the country. So usually what that means is that the most common approach then used, or the one that runs into the less political fights between countries, is actually to implement a subsidy and not actually a tax. So this is where Krugman comes and he notes, so what Eaton and Grossman show is that replacing the Connaught model with a Beatrice assumption reverses the policy recommendation, and this gives a bit of shakiness of any characterization of oligopoly behavior, which is not actually reassuring. It is better to reduce price of goods for your country's firm than to increase the price of a good of the foreign firm, basically. So that is something that you need to actually consider. We're evaluating our strategic trade policy. Government needs to understand that it can be a very tricky business when deciding what type of trade policy they need to follow. Some of the caveats they need to consider is the market structure. Are we dealing with perfect competition? Are we dealing with monopoly? What is the competition for resources? Do we need to actually implement subsidies so that we can actually gain some favor in a sector, that we become more competitive in a sector? Should we consider the entry and exit? Are we making profits? And is that profits going to the firms that we wanted to? Or is that profit actually pulling in other firms to enter into the market and take from their profits? We need to consider when we do taxes and when we do subsidies, what are the type of retaliation that might occur. We might end up having a non-stop game where everybody keeps reacting to another firm. And then we also need the idea of there being some information that is actually required, right? So we have full information about everything that is going to occur, that the government can actually do what is best for everything. That is for entirely for locally and for the world. And unfortunately, this probably is not going to be as much available as we would like. And this might just then make government's job a lot more harder. In conclusion, we've shown that trade policy would have different effects when we're dealing with imperfect competition. We have shown that quotas can be more restrictive than tariffs. We've shown also that strategic trade policy can work under certain conditions. And even though this policy prescriptions is not really robust, you need a lot of information, a lot of details, and we need to understand the idea of retaliation and some other caveats. And it is true that models of imperfect competition, usually speaking, have equilibrium conditions that are very suboptimal. So those are the things that we need to actually consider when dealing with strategic trade policy.